Welcome to the Trauma Across the Lifespan webinar series. This series includes 6 short videos discussing the effects of trauma across the lifespan, particularly the trauma that accompanies being a victim of crime and how this relates to victim advocates and other crime victim service providers. Each video also has a resource library associated with it, where you can revisit the key concepts and content covered, read the transcript, and find links to other resources for more in-depth learning. There are a couple ways we can think about the effects of trauma across the lifespan. We can think of it in terms of when during a person's lifespan trauma occurred. Did someone experience trauma as a toddler, or as an adolescent, or as an adult? Trauma can have different effects during different stages of life. We can also think about the effects of trauma across the lifespan in terms of how trauma experienced at any point in someone's life can affect them throughout their life moving forward, and how trauma can show up or resurface in different ways across someone's lifespan. We'll talk about the long-term effects of trauma, including triggers like anniversary reactions and re-traumatization that can continue for decades. We'll talk about how if someone experienced trauma earlier in life, the effects of that trauma might manifest in new ways when they enter into new relationships, when they become a parent, when they go through menopause and other aging milestones. And this is important to acknowledge because it's not uncommon for trauma survivors to seek help for traumatic experiences that occurred many years earlier because the effects of that earlier trauma are resurfacing. The good news is that healing is possible at any stage of life, and advocates and others working with crime victims can play a crucial role in this healing. First, let's talk about some of the foundational principles of trauma. In this module, we will cover what trauma is, particularly in crime victims, and what types of events can be traumatic. We will cover what experiencing trauma might look like for a crime victim and why no 2 crime victims will respond to trauma in the exact same way, including some foundational principles of how the brain and body respond during a traumatic event. And finally, we will look at how the effects of trauma might remain in the weeks and months following a traumatic event. The reason why we're starting this series with these foundational principles of trauma is because understanding the trauma response, including the psychology and biology underneath it, can really help us understand why the crime victims and trauma survivors we're working with behave the way they do and say some of the things they say, which can increase our own capacity for empathy. The trauma response is so complex, and it's not always clear whether what we're observing is related to trauma, and the more we learn about it, the easier it gets for us to recognize when someone else is having a trauma reaction, like being triggered. As we'll learn, no 2 people respond to trauma in the same way, and being able to recognize some of the different types of trauma reactions can then allow us to build skills for responding to them in a way that's actually going to work for that particular individual. We'll be learning about some of these skills in the upcoming modules. And finally, sharing information about the trauma response, including the biology of trauma, can be healing in and of itself for trauma survivors. It can be extremely validating for trauma survivors to learn that what they're experiencing has a real physical basis in the brain and body, that people are working hard to research and understand it, and that they're not alone or crazy or making it up. At the end of this webinar series, in Module 6, we'll go over some tips for how and when to discuss this information with clients. So what is trauma in crime victims? A traumatic experience poses a real or perceived threat to life, physical or psychological integrity, or social affiliation. Trauma can result from that experience. The medical field often uses the word trauma to refer to physical injuries related to a traumatic experience, such as a gunshot wound, broken bones, or a concussion. This is what trauma centers at hospitals treat. Social services fields often use the word trauma to refer to psychological injuries related to a traumatic experience, which show up as changes in mood, memory, and behavior. Trauma responses often do not include visible physical injuries to the flesh, and even if they do, psychological effects may remain after the physical injury is healed. We will be focusing our discussions here on the psychological effects of trauma because those are the effects that tend to be most overlooked and most chronic, lasting the longest across the lifespan. Psychological trauma is just as serious as physical trauma. You'll sometimes hear about the 3 E's of trauma: event, experience, and effects. And that's from the definition from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which says psychological trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So an experience that is psychologically traumatic is one that threatens a person's survival or sense of security and may or may not involve physical trauma. So for the first of the 3 E's of trauma, some of the most common events that can be traumatic include physical and sexual abuse or assault, harassment and bullying, childhood abuse or neglect, and long-term exposure to extreme poverty and systemic oppression. In the course of a lifetime, there may be quite a range of traumatic events experienced, from sudden death of a loved one to natural disasters. And not all of these experiences are related to crimes, like natural disasters and medical conditions. So while we are focusing on victims of crime, it's still important to consider any other traumatic experiences crime victims may have had in their life, as a person's trauma history will influence how they respond to crime victimization and what kinds of services or treatment they may need. A list of examples of potentially traumatic events is included on the resources page with this module, along with many other reproductions of the content we'll be covering here, so you can easily revisit anything you want to learn more about. So just focusing on crime victims now, we can consider that being a victim of any crime could be traumatic, from abuse and assault to arson and identity theft. What all crime victim experiences have in common, and what underlies all traumatic experiences, is a sense of helplessness and loss of control. Experiencing trauma is common, so common that almost 90% of people will experience at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. So why doesn't everybody have PTSD then? Because some of these events are more likely to lead to long-term negative consequences than others, and because everybody has a unique combination of risk factors that determine what their trauma response looks like. So some of the event-specific factors include deliberate acts of violence among people, like assault, abuse, and acts of terror like school shootings have more pervasive and longer-lasting effects than trauma like natural disasters or accidents. This type of trauma is referred to as interpersonal trauma, and it may have greater effects because intentional trauma between people shatters a belief system that people are trustworthy and mostly good, that the world is a just and meaningful place to live. Most victims of crime experience some form of interpersonal trauma. Moreover, trauma perpetrated by someone known to the victim can have unique effects compared to if the trauma was perpetrated by a stranger, a phenomenon described as betrayal trauma. When interpersonal trauma is perpetrated by someone the victim has an existing trusting relationship with, like a caregiver, partner, friend, doctor, teacher, the unique effects of betrayal trauma are highly likely, including more shame, dissociation, amnesia, and pervasive mental and physical health difficulties than other forms of trauma. We'll talk more about the effects of trauma soon. Another way to classify types of traumatic events relates to when and how often they occur, and you may hear categories of trauma like single incident, complex, secondary, intergenerational, or historical trauma. While single incident trauma is relatively brief in duration, like an accident, mugging, or shooting, complex trauma refers to pervasive trauma that is interpersonal in nature, occurs over important periods of development, usually beginning in childhood, and is prolonged or repeated over time. Complex trauma commonly results from children witnessing ongoing domestic violence in their home, children experiencing sexual abuse, or being a victim of human trafficking. It's important to be aware of complex trauma specifically because this is often what underlies long-term trauma responses across a lifetime. Secondary and intergenerational trauma are more indirect forms of trauma exposure. Intergenerational trauma is the impact of trauma experienced in one generation being passed down to the next generation. Secondary trauma can arise when someone hears firsthand about the traumatic experience of another and commonly affects advocates. Another type of trauma that is a type of intergenerational trauma is historical trauma, which Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart defined as the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding across generations, including the lifespan, which emanates from massive group trauma, such as slavery, genocide, and colonialism. We will talk more about intergenerational and historical trauma in Module 5. People will sometimes wonder, how can something like labor trafficking or home invasion be life-threatening if there was no physical violence or threat to physical safety with a weapon? This is why it's important to always consider the psychological effects of trauma and to consider humans' psychological survival needs alongside our physical bodily survival needs. The second E in the trauma definition about how trauma is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening is what we're talking about here. You might be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a pyramid that categorizes different levels of survival needs with physiological needs like air and water at the bottom, followed by safety needs, then love and belonging, then esteem, and at the top, self-actualization. The experience of any of these levels of need being threatened can be interpreted by the brain as life-threatening, not just the ones at the bottom of the pyramid like food, water, and oxygen. You may not think of someone breaking into your house and stealing your TV while you're away on vacation as being life-threatening, but your brain may interpret that experience as a threat to your security. I'm no longer safe in my home. If someone is able just to come in here and take what they want, what else could they do to me and my family? So this helps us understand why identity theft and home invasion can be traumatic, even if the victim never even knows who the criminal is or isn't present when the crime happened. This is a threat to the safety needs of resources, employment, and personal security, and the brain can interpret these as life-threatening. This is why emotional abuse can be traumatic. These are threats to a person's sense of self-esteem and freedom, which humans need for survival, and the brain can interpret these as life-threatening. So now that we can recognize what types of experiences can be traumatic and can understand why the victims or survivors we're working with might be feeling threatened or unsafe, let's talk about some common reactions to trauma. The third E of trauma is effects. No two crime victims will respond to trauma in the exact same way. Even among people who experience the same type of trauma, the effects of that trauma can vary wildly between individuals. Why do people respond so differently to trauma? The reason for this is because there are a multitude of factors that influence how an individual responds to trauma. Everybody has their own unique combination of risk and protective factors, which makes the traumatic stress response extremely varied. 4 of the biggest factors in what the effects of trauma will be are social support, life history, trauma dose and type, and genes, all of which can combine with each other to result in a unique individual trauma response. For social support, the single greatest risk factor for developing long-term post-traumatic symptoms after trauma is lack of social support, including community and system support. Resilience is highly dependent on our relationships with other people and the units and systems we interact with, like family, school, church, law enforcement, healthcare. And this is one of the most important factors to consider, not only because it does have the greatest effect on the trauma response, but because it's one of the only factors that we can actually influence. Advocates can be a source of support and can also help foster a victim's connections to other support systems. Life history we can't influence, but it's important to consider that people who have previously experienced trauma are at even greater risk for developing post-traumatic symptoms after a subsequent trauma. There's a cumulative effect of trauma over the course of a lifespan, especially if not properly treated, which is another reason that it's important to consider the effects of trauma across the lifespan. Other things with life history that are important to note are that historical and intergenerational trauma and identity can all influence how someone responds to trauma. Trauma dose and type. We already talked about how certain types of trauma, interpersonal trauma, trauma involving betrayal, and complex trauma can have unique effects. And the dose of trauma goes back to the cumulative effects of trauma when considering someone's life history. And genes. There are genetic and epigenetic factors that predispose individuals to respond to trauma in certain ways, which we will cover more in Module 5. And this is important to keep in mind for anybody who works with or interacts with trauma survivors, because it's easy for any of us to get caught in thinking things like, well, I know a person who went through the same thing that this other person went through, and they aren't acting like this. But if we understand that everybody responds to trauma differently, we can use our knowledge of the complexities of the trauma response to be more empathetic. One of the ways the trauma response is different for everyone is that it tends to happen on a continuum between arousal and dissociation that varies for each person and each situation. When the nervous system responds to trauma, most people's response falls somewhere in between complete arousal and complete dissociation. And it depends on factors related to the trauma itself, the individual, the environment, all those things we just talked about. States of arousal lead to hypervigilance and fight or flight. States of dissociation shut everything down and lead to losing track of time, feeling numb, and on the far end of the spectrum, fainting and immobility. These are basically just two different approaches to survival, and humans have been so successful because we have a wide range of survival responses to choose from, so we can survive a lot of different types of trauma. Opossums, for example, pretty much only have one strategy, and that is to play dead. And sometimes it works out for them, but a lot of times it doesn't. Other animals, like antelopes, pretty much only have fight or flight or freeze. Humans can have either of these responses and also a complex mixture of them falling somewhere in between. One of the in-between responses is called the fawn response, which is essentially submitting to the threat, working to appease or subdue the threat in an attempt to reduce harm. This could look like being compliant, going along with something even though you don't want to. Coercion as a tactic for abuse or assault takes advantage of the fawn response, and in cases of long-term abuse, we sometimes refer to this as Stockholm Syndrome. Let's see what the arousal and dissociation ends of the spectrum actually look like. Arousal responses include fight, flight, and freeze. These responses are meant to help someone escape or stop a traumatic event from happening and play a critical role in survival. The fight or flight response can happen during a traumatic event as well as many common life situations like slamming on the brakes when a car in front of you suddenly stops, jumping out of the way of an oncoming vehicle, getting spooked by someone jumping out from behind a door, or feeling unsafe when walking down a dark street. The reason why jumping out of the way of an oncoming vehicle isn't usually experienced as traumatic is because we are actually able to jump out of the way. It doesn't come with the same sense of helplessness and loss of control as most crime victimizations. Physical indications of a fight or flight response include dilated pupils, pale or flushed skin, trembling, and rapid heartbeat and breathing. The fight or flight response is preceded by a freeze response, where you catch your breath and pause, usually only for a split second, while the brain decides what response will be best for survival. If during this momentary freeze response, fight or flight both don't seem like effective options, the brain might opt for a dissociative response, which is essentially a prepare to be injured response, where you might just stay frozen instead of doing anything else. Dissociation is another effective survival mechanism that the brain uses when escape is impossible or when trying to fight or flee would lead to more harm. And it's especially common in children because children often don't have the agency to fight or flee. So the brain creates this dissociation to allow a person to endure the harm that they can't escape. Adults can experience this response too. It's just more common in children and in adults who experience trauma as a child. During dissociation, someone might experience one or both of the two main components of dissociation, depersonalization and derealization. Depersonalization is an out-of-body experience during which individuals often see themselves observing their own body from above, creating the perception that this is not happening to me. Derealization involves the sensation that things aren't real, it's just a dream, creating the perception that this is not really happening at all. Both of these mechanisms of dissociation reduce the emotional intensity of the experience and reduce the perception of pain. So let's talk briefly about the neurobiology of trauma and what's actually going on that's leading to all these effects. This diagram shows a side view of the brain as if it were cut right down the middle, splitting into left and right. The cortex assesses the situation, and it can tell if something is life-threatening or is inescapable, or if it's something we can't control. In a normal stress situation, the prefrontal cortex blocks the instinctual responses and uses its decision-making capabilities to allow us to decide how to respond to the stress. But if it's a traumatic stress situation, the prefrontal cortex gives control over to the amygdala and the fight or flight response happens. And at that point, we don't have conscious control over how we respond. And this is important to remember because victims will often wonder why they didn't do something differently. And it's because their survival instincts kicked in and took control to do what would be best for survival. And advocates can remind victims of this. At that point, all the brain cares about is staying alive. The survival instincts don't care if it's going to be questioned in court later why you didn't fight back differently. And then the hippocampus stores traumatic memories, but not in the same way regular memories are stored. During trauma, memories are not usually stored like a simple linear narrative of this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Trauma memories are stored in more discrete chunks of information relevant to survival, including a lot of sensory information. Someone may remember what color the carpet was or what someone smelled like, but not remember what day it was. This is because it doesn't matter what day it was for survival, but those sensory clues about the immediate surrounding environment might be important to detect similar threats later. So the brain holds on to those. Narratives can be pieced together later from these clues, but when a victim can't recall all the details of an event in chronological order right away, this is why. A lot of times when people talk about the neurobiology of trauma, they only talk about the brain, but the nervous system goes throughout the whole rest of the body too. This diagram shows your brain and spinal cord, and your brain is connected to the rest of your body through nerves that come out through the entire length of your spinal cord and connect with every single organ and part of your body, from your lungs and heart to your stomach, liver, kidneys, bladder, and reproductive organs. Some of the nerves are part of the sympathetic nervous system. These all come out in the areas around your rib cage. And some of the nerves are part of the parasympathetic nervous system. These nerves come out from your neck region and your tailbone region. They each go to the same places in the body, but each system does different things. The sympathetic nervous system is responsible for fight or flight. The parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for resting and digesting, and also for dissociative responses to stress. These systems essentially have opposite effects, and in normal stress situations, these two systems balance each other out. So a temporary, mild increase in sympathetic activity would allow someone to jump out of the way of an oncoming vehicle, and then the parasympathetic system would get activated and allow someone to go back to normal, like a gear shifter where the sympathetic system revs things up and the parasympathetic slows things down to keep you going at a steady pace. But in traumatic stress situations, either of these two systems is highly active. Focusing on the sympathetic nervous system now, which may be highly active in a traumatic stress situation, triggering the release of a lot of adrenaline from the adrenal glands right above your kidneys. Another system called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis uses hormones in the bloodstream instead of nerves to release stress response chemicals. In this system, your brain sends hormone signals to your pituitary gland, which then sends hormone signals to your adrenal glands to trigger the release of cortisol. And together, these two systems activate the fight or flight response that we just talked about. It's like pedal to the metal on the gas. Focusing on the parasympathetic nervous system now, which may also get activated during a traumatic stress situation and trigger the dissociative responses. This chart shows a continuum of defense reactions with hyperarousal and predominantly sympathetic activation on the left side, representing the first stages of a defense reaction, beginning with an initial information gathering freeze response, followed by fight or flight. But if the fight or flight responses aren't going to promote your survival, you'll start moving over to the right side of the graph toward parasympathetic activation. Tonic immobility at the top of the graph, right in between fight or flight and collapsed immobility. This is like if you're stepping on the gas and brake at the same time. It takes a lot of energy, but you're not moving. This is being frozen in the face of trauma and unable to move or scream, but being fully conscious of what's going on. But then if you get more parasympathetic activation, so slamming on just the brake pedal now, that's where collapsed immobility happens with changes in consciousness like those depersonalization and derealization responses. And even more activation leads to fainting, also called a vasovagal response. So all of that was just what happens in the brain and body in the immediate time surrounding trauma. And all those responses function to help someone survive. But most people also experience post-trauma symptoms for weeks to months after trauma. After trauma, almost everyone has responses that look like PTSD. These are normal responses to trauma. It's when they persist too long and interfere with healthy functioning that they become something in need of professional intervention. There are 4 main recognized categories of post-trauma responses: intrusion, avoidance, changes in cognition and mood, and changes in arousal and reactivity. Anybody who has experienced any type of trauma might experience some of these. Intrusions include intrusive memories, nightmares, and flashbacks. Avoidance includes behaviors like avoiding going back to the scene of a crime or people, places, things, or feelings that might remind someone of their trauma. Changes in cognition and mood include thinking like self-blame and persistent fear or anger. And changes in reactivity and arousal include sleep problems and exaggerated startle responses. If someone experiences a certain number of responses from each category for a certain length of time, they may be diagnosed with PTSD. But note that this is generally applicable to any kind of single incident trauma. But when you start talking about complex trauma that is repeated and interpersonal in nature and happens throughout childhood, the effects are much more pervasive than these. Complex trauma can uniquely disrupt a person's identity or sense of self and their relationship to other people in the world. It can disrupt personality, one's sense of meaning, and the capacity to express emotions and receive care. Long-term physical health problems, especially autoimmune, chronic pain, and digestive issues, are also common with complex trauma. During this time right after trauma, reactions often include shock, disbelief, denial, embarrassment, anger, vulnerability, or hopelessness. People will often judge themselves on the actions they took before and during the trauma, and it's important to remember that many trauma responses are not under our conscious control, and everything we do in the face of trauma is just trying to help us survive. Feelings of shame or self-blame after trauma are extremely common. This is a defense mechanism the brain uses to try to make sense of what happened in an effort to prevent it from happening again. But in reality, what happened is never the victim's fault, and advocates can remind victims of this. This chart is a representation of the effects of trauma over time, with a line illustrating emotional highs and lows, beginning with the trauma and rising with support received, but then falling with disillusionment. It shows that trauma can show up in a multitude of ways, and after appearing dormant for a long time, it can resurface due to specific triggers or re-traumatization, and the line continues to move up and down over time. The main takeaway is that the response to trauma and recovery from trauma is not a linear process. And this is just for one trauma, for a single incident trauma. So imagine how complicated this would be for complex trauma or for someone who had experienced multiple single incident significant traumas. They'll be having many triggers, multiple anniversary reactions, multiple things to grieve. The length of time any one person stays in these phases differs based on their resources for recovery, their life and trauma history, and any new experiences that impact recovery, such as the presence of triggers or new traumas. We'll talk more about triggers and re-traumatization in later modules. Focusing specifically on the period of time shortly after experiencing a traumatic event, if someone receives support after trauma, such as beginning to work with an advocate, a victim may steadily improve for a while as they find a new sense of safety and optimism that things will return to normal. And that hope and support can mitigate some of the effects of trauma they had been experiencing. This can happen even if the trauma happened a long time ago, but a victim is just now receiving help for the first time. But it's not uncommon for this initial phase of recovery to be followed by a phase of disillusionment where the effects of trauma resurface. This disillusionment may come as the benefits of healing work plateau or take longer than expected, as social support wanes when others return to business as usual, as new triggers are revealed, access to services end, or justice is not served to the victim's satisfaction. This is normal, and it doesn't mean you've done anything wrong as an advocate. Just remember that healing is not linear for anyone. Focusing a little farther out past the initial traumatic experience, support, or disillusionment, the effects of trauma may still persist in some people for months to years, even with receiving plenty of support. While a victim's well-being may begin to improve overall, there still may be many peaks and valleys of recovery that are impacted by trigger events, anniversary reactions, working through grief and coming to terms with what happened, and setbacks that can occur for a variety of reasons. Again, what someone's individual timeline of trauma and recovery looks like will depend on their unique factors like life history. Victims may experience a sensation of grief similar to the stages of grief when losing a loved one. They may grieve the loss of personal security, sense of fairness, trust in people and society, trust in law enforcement and the criminal justice system. Anger, rage, tearfulness, overwhelming sadness, loss of sense of humor, inability to concentrate, hyperprotectiveness, and a deep need to withdraw are all part of the psychological reactions to crime. This process can be confusing and frustrating at times for both the advocate and the victim, and remembering that this is a normal part of the healing process can help. One of the reasons that the effects of trauma can last so long is how the prefrontal cortex is affected by trauma. We already learned that the prefrontal cortex detects whether what is happening is traumatic in the moment, but after trauma, it can become chronically either overactive or underactive, which leads to different types of responses and behaviors that can last for years. Part of the reason why the prefrontal cortex may be affected for so long after trauma is because this is the reasoning and rationalizing part of the brain. And after trauma, it's constantly working to make sense of what happened so we can learn from the experience and maybe be able to prevent it from happening again. But so often we struggle to make sense of trauma. These things just don't make sense sometimes. This is where the shame and self-blame lives. So if someone's prefrontal cortex becomes chronically underactive after trauma, they may start exhibiting unregulated emotions and risky behavior and exaggerated responses to threats. If someone's prefrontal cortex is constantly overactive, they may start experiencing dissociative responses to even what seems like normal minor stressors. They may experience depression, a diminished response to threats that look like learned helplessness. Again, no two people respond in the same way. But many of these effects of trauma can be mitigated with positive, safe experiences and interactions with others, including advocates. So in summary, we learned that any crime victimization can be traumatic. The brain and body react during trauma with survival instincts that victims don't consciously control. No two crime victims will respond in the same way, and the effects of trauma can remain for weeks to months and can come and go over time. Ideally, you would think that after the trauma is over and you survived, everything would just go back to normal. And in some cases it does, but that's usually only true if there's an environment that supports healing after trauma. So if someone experiences trauma and is helped and believed and supported, has access to health care and receives justice for the harm that was done, and the harm actually stops. But that's not always the case for a lot of people, and often trauma goes untreated for a long time, and this is what really can lead to trauma responses that last throughout the lifetime. And also, in the case of children whose brains are still developing, experiencing trauma can impact the development of their brain, so long-term trauma responses are even more likely with childhood trauma. We'll talk about those in the next module. In the next module, we'll talk about childhood trauma and the developing brain and body. Then in Module 3, we'll cover adolescence and early adulthood. Module 4 will cover trauma in middle-aged and later life adults. Module 5 will cover intergenerational, historical, and cultural trauma. And finally, Module 6 will be full of tips and skills for advocates to put all this information to use. This concludes Module 1, Foundational Principles of Trauma. We hope you found this information useful. Thank you for watching, and please remember to visit the resource library included as a lesson with this module for more resources related to the foundational principles of trauma.